Trey Kay here, and you're listening to Us and Them. It's been nearly a year since COVID-19 came into our lives. Suddenly, it just changed everything and forced us all to stop and reconsider how we live our lives, day by day, moment by moment. These considerations and adaptations are something that we've carefully explored on Us and Them over the past year. And I'm pleased to say that there's another podcast out there that's been listening to what we're putting down. The Story Collider is a show that features people telling true personal stories about their relationship with science. And they asked me if I'd tell a story about how I've lived and worked through this pandemic. They wanted to know what's helped me make sense and get clarity on this whole COVID-19 experience. So here's an excerpt. It's my contribution to their episode about getting clarity on COVID-19. Enjoy. It's late March 2020, and I'm driving around Charleston, West Virginia. My sister has just called me to see if I'm okay. Apparently, Governor Jim Justice has just announced in his daily COVID-19 press briefings that he's ordering West Virginia state troopers to pull over any cars with license plates from New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Now, even though I was born and raised in West Virginia and still spent a great deal of time in the state working, I'm feeling like an outsider. And that's because I'm a New York resident and my car has tags from that state. And since the New York metropolitan area has had a frightening number of COVID cases, and at that time West Virginia had very few, Governor Justice and other West Virginians are very nervous about guys like me. And perhaps they have a right to be scared. I mean, one of the last things I did in New York City before driving down to West Virginia was attend a party for the radio show Studio 360. They were wrapping up after 20 years of broadcasting. And I was there with old friends and colleagues, chatting, drinking wine, and breathing the same air. After all that, I piled into my car and made my way down to West Virginia and started up with work on the radio podcast show that I do that's called Us and Them. And we were learning more at that time about how the virus was transmitting. And my editor, Kate Smith, encouraged me to attach my microphone to a 7-foot boom pole and wear a mask and gloves. And she says that I needed to protect myself and the people that I'm interviewing. When she first made these suggestions, I confess that it seemed like an overreaction. But I trust and respect Kate's opinion, but I was a little annoyed because her suggestions got in the way of the scenario that was in my head about this heroic journalist working in dangerous conditions. But my interviews went well. And the next day, I was supposed to drive down to Williamson, West Virginia, and do some more interviews. But when I got back to where I was staying at my mom's home in Charleston, I started to feel a little scratchy, like a cold was coming on. And I remember thinking to myself, is this the coronavirus? I mean, I've got a lot of work planned and man, if you get sick, you're going to screw up everything that you've been working on for months. And I mean, you don't know if you have COVID or not. You know, it may be a cold. What if you just push through and go and get these interviews? And if you find out later that you have COVID and maybe you had some warning signs before, that could be your little secret. I tossed and turned that night with uneasy dreams about being sick and getting others sick. And when I woke up that morning in March, I flipped on the television, and the main story in the news was about hospitals fearing that they may not have enough capacity to take a surge of COVID patients, and that there was a shortage of respirators. And my mind shifted to a scenario that my sore throat was going to progress to respiratory distress and hospitalization and a need for equipment that wasn't available. And then I started to think about the fact that I'm in my mom's basement and she's 81 and clearly in the category considered most vulnerable. And I didn't want to be responsible for getting her ill. And I started thinking about her on a respirator. And I began to ask myself, what the hell are you doing? And then I remembered being at a Trump rally in the media section when he would refer to all of us in the press area as enemies of the people. And I hated his media bashing. But as a journalist, and I'm out there doing interviews, what if I unknowingly was spreading this dangerous, novel coronavirus to people? Would that make me an enemy of the people? I wanted to make sure that I did not give President Trump any ammunition for his specious claims of the news media. Now, if you don't know my show, Us and Them, it's a podcast where we tell the stories about the things that divide Americans. And the fact that I live in an urban blue state in New York, and I spend a great deal of time in my home state, red, rural West Virginia, I feel like this gives me a unique perspective on these culture war divisions in our nation. But as this COVID pandemic was playing out, my team was having to pivot away from many of these culture war issues that we typically follow and focus on this newer us and them division that this microscopic virus was creating. We interviewed all kinds of people who told us about how COVID was significantly changing their lives. But one of the interviews really struck with me. I found this medical doctor, Damir Huramovic. He's a Bosnian American who specializes in psychiatry and psychosomatic medicine. I wanted to see if someone could break down the stages of a society's psychology during a pandemic, the same way that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had broken down the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Dr. Huramovic had published a book called The Psychiatry of Pandemics. And he researched just about every pandemic you can think of: Ebola, SARS, the AIDS crisis, the 1918 flu pandemic, the Black Plague, and even a pandemic going back to the time of the ancient Greeks. And one thing that he said that was in common in every one of these scenarios and how it affected their psychology, it happened at the end of the process. After all of the tribulation of the disease and the pandemic was over, kind of like when the lifeguard blows the whistle and says, okay, everybody back into the pool, that time when we're on the other side of the danger. Dr. Huramovic says there's a collective reaction in society where we say, what pandemic? A collective amnesia sets in, and any of the lessons learned that could be helpful just evaporate into the ether. After 3 months of this pandemic and summer started to bloom, I, like many others, had an acute case of cabin fever, and I was dying to get out. And then in early June, there was an event that presented an us and them moment for me. My brother invited me to a party. He and all of his friends were going to gather on his back patio for his birthday. And I have to tell you, I was really looking forward to this. I mean, I really wanted to connect with people, and I figured that we could do it safely outside without masks. And I don't know, this just seemed like it would be balm for the soul. But to get back onto his patio, I had to walk through his house, and To do that, I put on my mask, and I quickly realized as I was walking through his kitchen that I was the only one wearing one. And noticing my mask, my brother's girlfriend said, "Are you really going to wear that?" And I answered sheepishly, "Yeah, I am." And I went back onto the patio and I started talking to people, and I had a great time. But as much as I enjoyed the party and seeing people that I love and care about, it kept eating at me that I seemed to be the only one there taking this COVID thing seriously. Now, before I say another word, I don't want to come off as someone who's in the business of shaming people for not wearing a mask. I mean, I think based on advice of knowledgeable epidemiologists, it's a good idea for everyone to wear a mask. But I don't want to get in everybody's face about it. That said, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Huramovich's "what pandemic" comment. Was I at a party with people who thought this pandemic was over? Did they not think it was serious? Was this a political thing, like many of the things we explore on my program? My brother and I, we love each other, but we're on different sides of the political spectrum. I align more with progressive blue staters, and he considers himself a Reagan conservative. And he watches Fox News and all that stuff. But for him and his friends, I was wondering, was wearing masks akin to bowing, to using politically correct terms or phrases? Or was it just that they were exhausted from this oppressive pandemic and they just wanted a few normal hours of socializing? My family has a camp in West Virginia, and we gather there in the summer. But this past summer, because of COVID, I chose not to go. One day, I was clicking on Facebook, and I noticed a group of family and friends were all gathering there at the camp, and they were crowded around this table, elbow to elbow, eating crawfish. No masks, no social distance, just chowing down on spicy crawdads. And I thought, maybe this is a picture from last summer. But I checked the dates, and no, this was taken in 2020, the summer of the COVID era. And the photos prompted a range of reactions. On one hand, I was a little hurt that they didn't invite me. But I figured they concluded, Trey wouldn't come anyway. He's just too far gone with this COVID paranoia stuff. But later that summer, I learned there was a COVID outbreak from another gathering at the camp. And I felt like I'd made the right call not to go. I had a relative who was visiting from another state, and he came to the camp, and he was carrying the virus. He didn't know it. And several people contracted COVID. Now, these folks who got infected at the gathering, they were treated, and they avoided passing the disease on to anybody else. And I'm really grateful for that. But some of the people who emerged from this ordeal, much in the same way that Donald Trump did, concluded that this wasn't such a big deal. Yeah, they felt a little crappy, but that was it. And they were proud not to let COVID rule their life. I mean, that may be fine for some people. But when I heard this, it seemed like they were talking in a way that sounded like that the people who died of COVID, I don't know, that they hadn't been doing enough push-ups. Maybe these survivors from our camp incident hadn't really known anyone who died this terrible death. I know I got sobered up about COVID when I learned about a guy my age who I used to play music with in New York clubs. And he was happy and healthy on one day, sick on the next, and then dead on the day after that. And I knew a book author who needed knee replacement surgery early in the days of the pandemic. And he caught the disease, either in a hospital or from his physical therapy. I I had a friend whose mother was an invalid, and she contracted COVID from a caregiver, and she died. And a traveling nurse from West Virginia who I'd helped find an apartment in New York City because she wanted to go there and help work in the hospitals during this crisis. And she told me about the agony of families and the people dying separated from them. It just sounded horrible. And thinking about these stories, I realized I wasn't necessarily letting COVID rule my life, but I was letting it affect me. Years ago, the great program, This American Life, reported about a division in the United States Army called the Center for Army Lessons Learned. Ira Glass and his awesome producer, Nancy Updike, made a program back in 2007. And that was when the Army was considering the things they did in their 2003 invasion of Iraq. And this lessons learned wing of the Army considers the unsuccessful initiatives with the hope that they can learn from their mistakes. As we live through however long this pandemic takes, will we learn lessons that can help us in the future? When I spoke with Dr. Damir Huramovic back in March of 2020, he seemed to think that COVID-19 might be an important dress rehearsal for a more serious pandemic in the future. But I'm wondering what's in the cards for us. Are we destined for a round of post-pandemic social amnesia? Can we benefit from the center of lessons learned if, like my brother and I, we're dealing with two very different sources of facts? I don't really know. But for me, like everything with this pandemic, it's about breathing and waiting to see what happens next.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Us and them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Kate Smith, and Nissa Greenberg from The Story Collider. Special thanks to Aaron Barker, the artistic director of The Story Collider, and Zhen Shen, their technical director. If you'd like to hear the Clarity episode that I'm part of, which features Gaster Almonte and Mati Fajda Hashwayo Davis, and the comedian Freddie G., you can find those and other great stories at The Story Collider, which is at storycollider.org. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. Lelena Price provides us with images for the web. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.